When HOA bullies try to control your property, from your quirky garden gnomes to your private lake, standing your ground can turn their overreach into a resounding victory. Welcome back, everyone, to another explosive episode where we expose the extreme lengths homeowners go to protect their rights. Today, we dive into real-life stories of defiance, stories that prove that when you're pushed to the edge by overbearing HOAs, standing firm is not only an option, but a necessity. Steve Waybrook had called that house home for over 25 years, a modest 3-bedroom ranch inherited from his parents when he was just a teenager. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood, his property was a testament to simpler times and personal freedom. That was until one crisp autumn morning when an official-looking letter arrived in his mailbox, setting off a chain of events that would upend his world. The envelope bore the unmistakable insignia of the Karen Estates HOA, a community that Steve had never been a part of. He almost tossed it aside, thinking it was a clerical error, but curiosity got the better of him. Opening the letter, his eyes widened at the list of alleged violations. His grass, which had grown naturally to its full height, the paint on his shed, which he'd chosen in a hue he loved, and even the quirky collection of garden gnomes his late mother had left him. According to the HOA, each of these infractions was a threat to the community's aesthetic perfection. Your property is now subject to our community standards. The letter read in a tone that dripped with condescension. You must comply within 30 days or face fines of $100 per violation per day. Steve couldn't help but chuckle bitterly. His home, built in 1975, long before Karen Estates ever existed, was not even part of their jurisdiction. "They've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Determined to get to the bottom of the absurdity, Steve began his day with a mix of disbelief and resolve. "This is more than a mistake," he told himself. "It's an overreach, a blatant attempt to bully me into submission." He scoured his old property documents to confirm what he already suspected. His land was never part of the fancy gated community that the HOA boasted about. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This time, the message was even more aggressive, a thinly veiled threat of legal action if he didn't comply with their impossible demands. That was the final straw. Steve decided to attend the next monthly board meeting at their pristine clubhouse, determined to confront the issue head-on. The meeting hall was a scene from another world. Polished floors, expensive decor, and a group of residents dressed as if they were about to attend a country club gala. At the front, Mrs. Vicky Candle Lake, the HOA president, presided over the meeting with an air of unyielding authority. When it was his turn, Steve strode to the podium. His voice was steady as he declared, "Good evening. I'm Steve Waybrook from 46 Worth Street. I've received these letters listing violations, yet I have every document to prove my property isn't even part of Karen Estates." Mrs. Candle Lake's eyes narrowed as she responded, "Mr. Waybrook, your property borders our community and affects our home values. Therefore, you fall under our jurisdiction." Steve couldn't hide his disbelief. "That's not how property law works," he countered. "My house was built decades before your HOA ever existed. I never signed up for your rules, and I certainly don't appreciate your intrusion." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as murmurs rippled among the well-dressed board members. Mrs. Candle Lake shuffled her papers, her tone icy. "We have recently expanded our jurisdiction, and our legal counsel assures us that this extension is perfectly legal." "Legal counsel?" Steve interjected sharply. "Where is this counsel? I'd very much like to speak with them." She brushed him off with a dismissive wave. "They're not present tonight, Mr. Waybrook. But rest assured, you have 2 weeks to comply or face further fines." Frustration boiling over, Steve's eyes blazed with determination. "I'm not a member of your HOA, and I will not let your arbitrary standards dictate how I live on my own property," he said firmly. "If you wish to impose your will on me, then I suggest we resolve this in court." A ripple of gasps and whispers filled the room. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but Mrs. Candle Lake's confident smile did little to mask her underlying irritation. As the meeting adjourned, Steve felt a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. He knew the battle was just beginning, a battle that would test not only his resolve, but also the very limits of authority. Walking out of the clubhouse, Steve was already planning his next move. He would gather every scrap of evidence, from old tax records to every violation notice, and prepare for the legal fight of his life. This is about more than just a garden or a shed, he thought. It's about standing up against bullying authority. As he returned home, the early evening light cast long shadows over his property, a symbol of the dark days ahead. But Steve felt a spark of hope. In his heart, he knew that no one had the right to dictate his life or crush his individuality. And with that conviction, the first chapter of his defiant resistance began. It was early summer, the season when the warmth of the sun invited long afternoons by the water. For Jack Morris, his private lake had always been a sanctuary, a quiet escape where he could fish, kayak, and simply revel in nature's calm. Jack had recently settled into his modest lakeside home, a place he'd long dreamed of since his youth, and he took immense pride in the little paradise he now called his own. That particular Saturday began like any other. Jack had woken up early, relishing the gentle, early morning light dancing on the lake's surface. He strolled down to the water's edge, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, ready to cast his line and lose himself in the serene embrace of nature. But as he settled onto his favorite worn wooden bench, he noticed a cluster of people gathering near the lake's access gate, a gate he had always kept securely locked. Jack's heart sank as he realized what was happening. A group, led by a familiar face, was approaching his property. Not again, he muttered under his breath. Almost immediately, a woman in a crisp, pastel suit stepped forward. It was Karen, a long-time, outspoken member of the HOA notorious for her aggressive insistence on following community protocols. "Good morning," Karen chirped, her tone overly cheerful as if greeting an old friend, though her eyes betrayed her determination. "We're here for our annual Lake Day. You know, the event that brings our community together." Jack stood, his voice firm yet measured as he replied, "I'm sorry, Karen, but this lake is part of my private property. I bought it with the understanding that it would remain my sanctuary." Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before she quickly recovered. "Oh, Jack, you misunderstand. The lake has been a central feature of our neighborhood for years. It's on your lot, but it also belongs to our community spirit. We pay fees that contribute to its maintenance, and the HOA has long encouraged its use for communal activities." Jack shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "The deed to my property clearly shows that the lake is included as a private amenity. I appreciate your community spirit, but I cannot let you or anyone else use my lake without my consent." The air crackled with tension as neighbors gathered around, some stepping back while others watched, torn between supporting Jack and the familiar call of communal tradition. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Karen persisted. "Jack, don't be difficult. Imagine the fun we could all have. There's enough space for everyone. Besides, it's tradition, a legacy that unites us." But Jack's voice was unwavering. "Traditions must be built on respect. I value our community, but I must also protect my rights as a property owner. I'm not going to let anyone trespass here just because you claim a piece of community that isn't yours to take." Karen's tone grew sharper. "You're being unreasonable, Jack. This isn't about property rights. It's about our shared heritage and the collective beauty of our neighborhood." At that moment, a couple of onlookers began to side with Jack. One neighbor, clearly fed up with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, stepped forward. "Jack's right. We all know he paid a fair price for this property, and if he wants to keep his lake private, that's his right. You can't just force people to participate in your events." Karen's eyes flashed with frustration. "You don't understand. This lake is a symbol for us. It represents unity and pride. How can you deny the community this simple pleasure?" Jack took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. "I'm recording this conversation," he stated calmly, "not because I want to escalate things, but because I want everything to be clear. I have all my property documents, and I'm more than willing to show them if necessary." The conversation escalated quickly. Karen tried to edge closer to the locked gate, attempting to force it open, but Jack firmly blocked her path. Stop, Karen. This gate isn't for you to tamper with, he warned, his voice steady but laced with unmistakable authority. As voices rose, a couple of police officers arrived on the scene, alerted by concerned neighbors. One officer, after hearing both sides, approached Jack. "Sir, are you sure this property is entirely yours?" he asked, flipping through the documents Jack had on his phone. Jack nodded, confident. "Yes, officer. The paperwork is clear. I own every inch of this land, including the lake." Karen's face reddened as the officer confirmed Jack's claim. The officer then politely advised the group, "Since the property is private, I must ask you to vacate the premises immediately. We're here to ensure everyone's safety, not to take sides in disputes." With the police escorting the HOA group back to their community area, the tension began to dissipate, though a lingering undercurrent of discontent remained. Jack's neighbors approached him, some offering words of support, others expressing regret that a cherished tradition had to be challenged. Later that afternoon, as Jack sat by his beloved lake once more, he couldn't help but reflect on the events of the day. "This isn't about denying anyone a good time," he mused softly to himself. "It's about standing up for my rights and ensuring that community traditions are respected, not imposed." As the sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the water, Jack resolved to ensure that his property would remain a place of peace, a private haven unmarred by the overreach of external authority. His resolve was firm, and he knew that this battle was just another chapter in the ongoing struggle to balance community spirit with individual rights. In the wake of all the property battles and defiant declarations, another unexpected confrontation was about to flare up, this one not over lawns or lakes, but over the very appliances that kept the household running. It all began on an otherwise unremarkable autumn day, when Linda Parker's peaceful routine was shattered by the aftermath of a house fire. Linda had inherited the modest family home from her parents, a place filled with memories of laughter and togetherness. Although the fire had ravaged parts of the house, the damage had been contained. The structure was salvageable, and the appliances, those trusty kitchen and laundry workhorses, had survived, albeit with a few scars. The incident, traumatic as it was, left the family grappling with insurance claims and repairs. Amidst this chaos, one nagging issue loomed large: the home appliance service plan. For years, Linda's parents had subscribed to a monthly appliance service plan, a safety net that promised repairs or replacements for any malfunctioning device. With the house now in a state of disrepair, the family saw an opportunity to cancel the plan and save on unnecessary expenses. Linda, acting as the spokesperson for her family, dialed the service center with cautious optimism. "Hello, this is Linda Parker. I'm calling regarding our appliance service plan. We recently experienced a house fire, and while our appliances were damaged, they're still functional. I'd like to cancel the plan effective immediately," she explained, her tone measured and polite. On the other end of the line, a curt voice replied, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you're still obligated to continue the service plan for the current billing cycle in the next month. We can't cancel it until that period is complete." Linda's brow furrowed as she pressed the phone tighter against her ear. "But I'm not asking to skip a month. I'm asking to cancel the plan right now. We're dealing with enough already with the insurance claim and repairs. We don't need to pay for something we're not going to use." There was a pause before the representative spoke again, his tone tinged with rehearsed sympathy. "I understand your frustration, ma'am, but our policy is very clear. You're bound by the terms of the contract, and, as much as I'd like to help, I can only cancel the plan at the end of the next payment cycle." Linda could hardly contain her disbelief. "Are you telling me that despite everything we've been through, a house fire, temporary displacement, and all the emotional turmoil, I'm still forced to pay for a service I don't need?" Her voice, now a mix of incredulity and anger, resonated with determination. Before the conversation could descend further into bureaucratic drudgery, Linda was transferred to a supervisor. The new voice, warmer yet firm, introduced himself as Marcus. "Ms. Parker, I've reviewed your case. I can see that your situation is unique. Let me ask you, how long have you been with us?" "Since before the fire," Linda replied sharply. and never once have I missed a payment. But now, given the circumstances, I feel it's unreasonable to continue paying for a plan that only adds to our burdens." Marcus hesitated, the background noise of a busy call center audible in his tone. "I can offer an exception, Ms. Parker. We could cancel the plan effective immediately, but you would still be responsible for this month's payment." Linda's frustration bubbled over. "That's not acceptable. I'm dealing with the recovery of my home and my family's well-being. I shouldn't be penalized for a situation that's beyond our control. This isn't about the policy, it's about common decency." Marcus sighed, and then his tone softened. "I truly understand, Ms. Parker. Let me put you on a brief hold while I confer with my manager." Minutes felt like hours as Linda listened to the silence on the line. Finally, Marcus returned. "Ms. Parker, my manager has authorized an immediate cancellation of your service plan with no further charges. We'll also process a refund for any payments made beyond the period of service rendered." A sigh of relief escaped Linda. "Thank you, Marcus. I appreciate that you're taking our situation into account." Marcus replied, "Of course. We value our customers, and I apologize for any distress this has caused. I'll send you a confirmation email shortly." As the call ended, Linda couldn't help but reflect on the bizarre intensity of the appliance showdown. What began as a minor contractual dispute had escalated into a symbol of a larger battle against inflexible institutions. The encounter left her with a renewed sense of empowerment, a belief that even the most entrenched policies could be challenged when confronted with genuine hardship and a resolute spirit. Later that evening, as Linda sat with her family in the partially repaired living room, she recounted the conversation. "It wasn't just about the service plan," she explained to her parents and younger brother. "It was about standing up for our rights, for our dignity. I refused to let them treat our tragedy as just another transaction." Her father, his eyes glistening with pride, nodded in agreement. "You did well, Linda. Sometimes it takes courage to fight for what's fair, even when it's just a phone call." That night, as the family gathered around a flickering lamp, the story of the appliance showdown became a rallying cry, a reminder that, in a world governed by rigid rules and indifferent policies, a single voice raised in defiance could spark change. And for Linda Parker, that defiance was just the beginning of reclaiming the power and dignity that every homeowner deserved. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. The early morning mist hung low over the courthouse steps, lending an almost eerie quality to the scene as Steve Waybrook, flanked by his attorney Natasha Sakini, strode confidently into the courtroom. For weeks, his home had been transformed into a battleground, a stage for defiance against the overreaching authority of the Karen Estates HOA. Now, he was here not only to defend his right to live as he pleased, but to challenge a system that sought to bully him into submission. Inside the courtroom, a hushed tension pervaded the air. Rows of spectators, some local residents, and others merely curious onlookers, filled the benches. At the front, the judge, a dignified woman with decades of experience etched in the lines of her face, sat with a calm, yet commanding presence. Across from Steve sat the HOA's lawyer, whose anxious shifting betrayed his lack of conviction in their case. As the proceedings began, the judge called the session to order. "Mr. Waybrook, Ms. Sakini, please present your evidence regarding the claim of jurisdiction over your property," she said, her voice measured and authoritative. Natasha rose first. "Your Honor, we have here a series of documented violations that the HOA alleges were committed by Mr. Waybrook. However, the underlying premise of their claim is utterly flawed. I submit that Mr. Waybrook's property predates the formation of Karen Estates by decades, and he never consented to be bound by any of its arbitrary regulations." She proceeded to lay out her evidence. Copies of old tax records, property surveys, and a meticulously compiled dossier of photographs and videos capturing the HOA board members as they repeatedly trespassed on Steve's property. At one point, a grainy video played in court, showing a board member using a ruler to measure the length of Steve's grass, a scene that drew murmurs from the gallery. Steve interjected with quiet resolve. "Your Honor, I've always taken pride in my home and my garden. These violations were never about upkeep or community spirit. They were simply an excuse for the HOA to impose their will on someone who didn't sign up for their rules. The HOA lawyer attempted to counter, his voice trembling slightly as he argued, "Your Honor, the board maintains that any property impacting the aesthetic appeal of the community falls under our jurisdiction. Mr. Waybrook's nonconformity is not only a personal choice, but one that allegedly affects the property values of our neighborhood." A murmur ran through the courtroom as Natasha calmly rose again. "If I may, Your Honor," she asked, directing her words at the judge. The concept of jurisdiction in this instance is nothing more than a convenient invention by the HOA. Our legal system clearly defines property boundaries, and there is no clause that allows a homeowners association to extend its authority over pre-existing properties without express agreement. The board's recent so-called expansion of jurisdiction is not supported by any legal precedent. The judge leaned forward, her eyes piercing through the documents spread before her. "Ms. Sakini, are you suggesting that the HOA is not only overstepping its bounds, but also harassing Mr. Waybrook?" she asked. "Precisely, Your Honor," Natasha replied. "Their actions, sending repeated violation notices, daily photo surveillance, and even physically measuring the property, constitute harassment. We are seeking not only a dismissal of all fines and claims, but also compensation for the emotional distress and legal expenses incurred by Mr. Waybrook." At that moment, Steve's gaze hardened as he recounted his experience. "I didn't create the Gnome Kingdom to defy some arbitrary standard," he said firmly. "I did it to reclaim my home, to show that no one has the right to dictate how I live on my property. I just want to be left alone, to live in peace without being bullied by an organization that's lost all sense of fairness." The judge took a moment, reflecting on the evidence and the passionate pleas from both sides. Finally, she addressed the courtroom in a tone that brooked no argument. "After reviewing the documents and hearing the arguments presented, it is clear that the Karen Estates HOA has acted outside the scope of its legal authority. Mr. Waybrook's property, established long before the HOA's formation, is not subject to these arbitrary rules. Furthermore, the repeated harassment and trespassing by board members will not be tolerated." A murmur of approval echoed through the room as the judge continued. "The court hereby dismisses all fines and claims levied against Mr. Waybrook. Additionally, the HOA is ordered to pay compensation for Mr. Waybrook's legal fees and for emotional distress, a sum that reflects the severity of their misconduct." In that moment, the tension that had gripped Steve for months began to lift, replaced by a sense of vindication. The HOA's lawyer, visibly deflated, shuffled his papers as the judge concluded, "Let this ruling serve as a reminder that no private organization can impose its will on an individual without consent. Property rights and personal freedoms must be respected." As the gavel struck, the courtroom erupted in subdued applause. Outside, the sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a hopeful glow over the courthouse steps. For Steve, this victory was more than a legal win. It was a declaration of independence, a resounding affirmation that individual rights trumped arbitrary power. Walking out of the courtroom with Natasha by his side, Steve couldn't help but smile. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. "We've shown them that the spirit of freedom can't be caged by rules and regulations." Natasha nodded, her eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. "Indeed, Steve. Today, you've set an example for every homeowner who's ever been bullied by an overreaching authority. And today, the law has spoken in your favor." As they stepped into the light of a new day, the weight of injustice slowly lifted, leaving behind a promise of resilience and hope. A promise that no matter how powerful the institution, the power of the individual, armed with truth and courage, would always prevail. The courthouse verdict still echoed in Steve Waybrook's mind as he stepped out into a crisp morning, the victory taste both sweet and sobering. Over the past several months, the battles, each as personal as they were public, had shaken the foundations of the Karen Estates HOA. Now, with the judge's ruling resonating like a clarion call for justice, the community braced itself for a new era. In a quiet neighborhood cafe that morning, Neighbors gathered to exchange stories and discuss what had transpired. Jack Morris, the man who had fiercely defended his private lake, leaned forward over his coffee, his eyes alight with determination. "I never thought standing my ground would lead to this kind of change," he said, his voice low but filled with hope. "But when you look around, you can see that the HOA isn't untouchable anymore." Linda Parker, still recovering from her own appliance showdown, nodded emphatically. "I've learned that even the smallest battles can ripple into something greater." My call to cancel that service plan, it wasn't just about saving money. It was about demanding respect. "They can't treat us like numbers in a contract," she remarked, glancing around the table as if to ensure everyone felt the truth of her words. Meanwhile, at Steve's old house, now an unofficial symbol of defiant independence, the Gnome Kingdom stood proudly amid a riot of vibrant colors and playful arrangements. The hot pink shed and the towering inflatable dragon, Spike, had become icons of resistance. One neighbor, Sarah, who had once hesitated at the sight of the extravagant decorations, now admitted, "I used to think it was all a bit much. But now, every time I see Spike and the gnomes, I'm reminded that our individuality is something to be celebrated." The local media had caught wind of these events, turning what was once a dispute into a movement. Headlines blared, "HOA overreach meets homeowner defiance," and "Community rises against bullying board." And with each passing day, more residents found their voices, united by the belief that personal freedom was non-negotiable. Late one afternoon, as a neighborhood barbecue gathered momentum in the community park, a symbolic gesture of reconciliation and newfound solidarity, Steve found himself at the center of a heartfelt conversation with several former members of the HOA board. One of them, a soft-spoken man named Tom, confessed, "I was part of the old board, and I now see how blind we were to the rights of the individual. Your courage made me question everything." Steve, still modest about his achievements, replied, "I never set out to be a hero. I just wanted to live my life on my own terms. But if this helps inspire others to stand up for their rights, then maybe all our struggles weren't in vain." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the gathering, a spirited dialogue unfolded among the residents. A young couple, fresh from moving into the neighborhood, voiced their gratitude. "We moved here thinking we were getting the charm of community living. Now we know it means community with respect. Respect for our privacy and our freedom to be ourselves." Across the park, Linda's phone buzzed with messages of support. One message read, "Your determination in the face of absurd policies reminded me that change is possible. Thank you for fighting for us all." The simple words carried a weight that was felt by every homeowner who had endured the relentless harassment of arbitrary rules. In a quieter moment later that evening, Jack and Steve met by the edge of the lake. The water, reflecting the last rays of sunlight, seemed to whisper promises of peace. Jack broke the silence, saying, "You know, Steve, today isn't just about winning a court case. It's about reclaiming our lives from an institution that thought it could dictate our every move." Steve smiled, the memory of every challenging moment softening into a quiet resolve. "Absolutely. We've shown that when we stand together, our voices are too powerful to be silenced. This victory, our victory, is a beacon for everyone who's ever felt oppressed by unfair rules." As the barbecue wound down and the stars began to the twilight sky, a palpable sense of unity and liberation settled over the neighborhood. The old, overreaching HOA had been forced to reckon with its mistakes, and a new board, more attuned to the needs and rights of the residents, was already taking shape. In that final moment of the day, as laughter mingled with the gentle night breeze, it was clear that this was more than just the end of a legal battle. It was the beginning of a community reborn, a community where creativity, respect, and the fierce defense of personal freedom were the true measures of value. And for every homeowner, the promise was simple: your property, your rules, and above all, your right to live unburdened by unreasonable authority. If you believe in defending your rights and protecting your sanctuary, remember, you are never alone in your fight. Every act of defiance, every moment of resistance, brings us one step closer to a fairer world. Subscribe to our channel and hit that like button to support more stories of courage and triumph over injustice. Stand strong, stay united, and let your voice be heard, because no one should ever be bullied out of their own home.